Tonight, after sunset, you'll probably tap a switch without giving it a second thought. In an instant, your room will be filled with light. It's one of those everyday conveniences we barely notice. But for almost the entire history of our species, that simple luxury didn't exist. Once the sun disappeared below the horizon, darkness took over. Not the faint glow of a modern city, but true, overwhelming darkness, where even your own hands could vanish from sight. For more than 300,000 years, nearly every one of your ancestors spent close to half of their lives under that darkness. There were no streetlights, no flashlights, no electric bulbs, and for most of that time, not even candles. Their nights were lit only by the stars above and the fire they managed to keep burning. So what happened after sunset? How did they spend those long hours before sleep? The answer is far more surprising than most people realize. It reshapes how we think about sleep, human connection, and the very beginnings of civilization. To understand it, we have to begin with one of humanity's greatest discoveries: fire. The earliest convincing evidence that humans controlled fire comes from Wonderwort Cave in South Africa, dating back nearly 1 million years. But fire did much more than provide warmth or protection from predators. It fundamentally changed the rhythm of human life, turning the night into something people could actually use instead of simply endure. And that's where this story really begins. Before humans learned to control fire, our nights looked much like those of every other primate. As daylight disappeared, the safest choice was to climb into a tree or hide somewhere secure and remain completely still. After dark, the world belonged to predators. Humans aren't built for night vision. Compared to animals like leopards, hyenas, or wolves, our ability to see in darkness is remarkably poor. Venturing out after sunset often meant taking a deadly risk. Then, everything changed. A single campfire created a small island of security in an otherwise dangerous landscape. Its light and flames formed a protective zone, roughly 30 feet across, where most predators were reluctant to enter. Beyond that glowing circle, survival became far less certain. This isn't just speculation. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer communities have found that people who leave the safety of the fire after dark face a much greater risk of predator attacks, even in the present day. But the real revolution wasn't just safety. Fire gave humans something no other primate had ever enjoyed: extra waking hours. Think about it. Before fire, daylight determined your schedule. Once the sun disappeared, productive time was essentially over. Depending on the season, people might have only 8 to 12 hours of usable daylight. By extending light into the night, fire added another 2 to 4 hours when people could stay awake, interact, work, learn, and share ideas. Those extra hours may have become some of the most important moments in human history. Those few extra hours each evening may not sound like much, but across thousands of generations, they transformed the course of human evolution. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner published a remarkable study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. She spent years observing and recording conversations among the Juhansi people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the few communities whose traditional lifestyle still resembles that of our distant ancestors. The contrast between day and night was remarkable. During daylight hours, nearly 80% of conversations focused on practical matters: planning hunts, gathering food, discussing resources, solving disputes, and organizing everyday life. Daytime conversations were largely about survival. But once darkness fell and people gathered around the fire, everything changed. Instead of talking about daily tasks, most conversations turned into stories. People shared legends, told jokes, described distant places, retold memorable adventures, and explained how they believed the world began. Laughter replaced logistics, and imagination replaced routine. According to Wiesner, these nighttime conversations may have played a crucial role in shaping human culture. Knowledge could be passed from one generation to the next, social bonds grew stronger, and ideas expanded far beyond the immediate challenges of staying alive. In many ways, that glowing fire became humanity's very first classroom, its first stage, and perhaps even its first place of shared belief and tradition. Those evenings around the fire did more than entertain people. They encouraged something uniquely human, the ability to imagine worlds beyond the one directly in front of us. Around those flames, people dreamed up myths, planned for the future, and shared ideas that existed only in their minds. In many ways, this is where human imagination truly began to flourish. But storytelling wasn't the only hidden secret of the ancient night. Modern science has uncovered another surprising discovery, one that challenges the way most of us think about sleep. The 8-hour, uninterrupted night's sleep that feels normal today may actually be a relatively recent habit. In 2001, historian Roger Ekirch published groundbreaking research after spending 16 years examining historical documents from across different centuries. His investigation uncovered more than 500 references describing a sleeping pattern that has almost disappeared from modern life. The evidence appeared everywhere. Religious writings from the 1400s, personal diaries, legal records, medical texts, private letters, and even ancient literature such as Homer's Odyssey. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. People regularly referred to a first sleep, followed by a second sleep. Before factories, electric lights, and modern work schedules reshaped daily life, many people would fall asleep soon after nightfall, sleep for roughly 4 hours. Naturally, wake for an hour or two, and then drift into a second period of sleep that lasted until dawn. To us, waking in the middle of the night might sound like a sleep disorder. For most of human history, however, it appears to have been perfectly normal. For countless generations, this wasn't considered unusual. It was simply the way people slept. And those quiet hours between the two periods of sleep weren't wasted. People used them in surprisingly meaningful ways. Some reflected on their dreams while every detail was still vivid. Others wrote in journals, prayed, read by the fire, visited nearby neighbors, or simply sat in silence, letting their thoughts wander. Even medical advice from centuries ago treated this wakeful period as something beneficial rather than a problem. A French physician in the 1500s even suggested that married couples were more likely to conceive during these nighttime hours, believing the body was especially well prepared. Another medical guide from the same era described this interval, often called the watch, as the ideal time for study, meditation, and careful reflection. With the world asleep and distractions almost non-existent, many believed the mind was at its clearest. For generations, historians encountered references to first sleep and second sleep in ancient texts. Yet many assumed the writers meant something else entirely. The idea that humans once followed a completely different sleep pattern seems so unfamiliar that translators often reinterpreted the original Greek and medieval Latin, forcing the words to match modern expectations instead of their original meaning. Then scientific research began to reveal that those old texts may have been describing reality all along. The historical evidence was compelling, but the most convincing support came from modern science. In 1992, psychiatrist Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health conducted a fascinating experiment to see what would happen if people lived without artificial light. A group of volunteers spent an entire month experiencing long winter-like nights, with roughly 14 hours of darkness every day, conditions much closer to those our ancestors would have known before electric lighting transformed human life. At first, their sleep was irregular, but after a few weeks, something unexpected happened. Every participant naturally settled into nearly the same rhythm. They slept for about 4 hours, woke up for 1 to 3 hours of calm wakefulness, and then returned to sleep for another 4 hours until morning. No one instructed them to follow this schedule. No alarms, no coaching, no special training. Their bodies adopted it on their own, as though an ancient biological rhythm had simply been waiting for the right conditions to reappear after centuries of exposure to artificial light. Ware also analyzed what was happening inside their bodies during those quiet nighttime hours. He found unusually high levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with deep relaxation and calm, which is also elevated during activities such as meditation and after orgasm. Rather than feeling restless or anxious, participants commonly described the experience as deeply peaceful, reflective, and almost dreamlike. That period between the two sleeps wasn't merely empty time. It appeared to be a unique mental state, unlike the fast-paced alertness most of us experience during the day. That quiet interval wasn't simply a pause between two stretches of sleep. It appears to have been a completely different state of consciousness, one that many people today may never naturally experience. So why did it disappear? The biggest reason was surprisingly simple. Artificial light. Beginning in the 1600s, European cities started illuminating their streets after sunset. One of the earliest large-scale efforts took place in Paris under Louis XIV, where street lighting was introduced in part to improve public safety. Other cities, including London, gradually followed. For the first time, darkness was no longer an unavoidable part of everyday life. As technology advanced, light became cheaper and more accessible. Candles became more affordable, gas lamps spread throughout the 1800s, and then everything changed again. In 1879, Thomas Edison helped commercialize the practical electric light bulb. Within just a few decades, people could extend their evenings almost indefinitely, fundamentally changing a nightly routine that had shaped humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. Even our language preserves reminders of that older world. The English word curfew comes from the French phrase couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. In many medieval towns, an evening bell signaled households to cover or extinguish their fires before going to bed. Night was expected to be dark, quiet, and largely inactive. For most of human history, being outside after dark was unusual. Once the sun disappeared, the safest place was close to home, protected by family, shelter, and the glow of a small fire. Only recently has humanity turned the night into something that resembles an extension of the day. In many medieval European cities, walking through the streets after dark without carrying a lantern wasn't just discouraged, it could actually break the law. Night was viewed very differently than it is today. It was associated with danger, uncertainty, crime, and superstition. Once daylight disappeared, most people stayed indoors because the darkness itself was considered a threat. Over time, humanity changed that completely. We illuminated the streets, homes, and entire cities, transforming the night into a place where work, travel, and entertainment could continue long after sunset. It was a remarkable technological achievement. But that transformation also came with hidden biological costs. Today, the average person spends 7 to 8 hours under artificial lighting. After the sun goes down, bright indoor lights, and especially the blue light emitted by phones, tablets, and computer screens, can interfere with the body's natural production of melatonin, the hormone that helps regulate our sleep-wake cycle. Your brain doesn't actually recognize whether that light comes from the morning sun or an LED screen. When bright light reaches your eyes, late at night, your internal clock receives a signal that it's still daytime. As a result, melatonin production is delayed, sleep becomes less consistent, and the circadian rhythm that developed over millions of years begins to shift.